On the morning of April 5, 1933, the United States ceased to be a free market in the most fundamental sense of the term, though few citizens realized the gravity of the shift as they sipped their coffee. The air in Washington, D.C. was heavy, not just with the humidity of the Potomac, but with the suffocating weight of an economic depression that had stripped the nation of its dignity. It was a time when the very fabric of capitalism seemed to be unraveling, with breadlines stretching around city blocks and the distinct metallic smell of despair permeating the industrial corridors of the Midwest. In this atmosphere of unparalleled panic, a document was drafted that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the American citizen and their government. It was not a law passed after raucous debate in Congress, nor was it a constitutional amendment ratified by the states. It was a directive born in the shadows of the executive branch, a weaponized piece of paper that turned the preservation of one's own wealth into a criminal act against the state. This was Executive Order 6102. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed it, he didn't just alter monetary policy. He effectively nationalized the concept of value itself. The order explicitly forbade the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. The language was not bureaucratic or vague, it was a direct threat. Section 2 of the order required all persons to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve by May 1, 1933. The punishment for failing to comply was draconian, designed to instill a primal fear in the population, a fine of $10,000 equivalent to roughly $230,000. In today's purchasing power, or 10 years in federal prison, or both. Imagine the scene at local bank branches across the country in the weeks that followed. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, and widows, standing in somber lines, handing over the only immutable asset they possessed in exchange for paper currency that the government had just proven it could manipulate at will. They were told it was a patriotic duty, a necessary sacrifice to break the back of the deflationary spiral. But in reality, they were the victims of the greatest authorized heist in modern history. The narrative we are sold in history books is one of benevolent rescue. We are told that the gold standard was a barbarous relic that constricted the money supply, preventing the Federal Reserve from stimulating the economy during its darkest hour. This is the consensus view, repeated ad nauseum by Keynesian economists and central bank apologists for 9 decades. They argue that the rigid adherence to gold forced the Fed to keep interest rates high to defend the dollar, thereby strangling commerce. By severing this link, FDR supposedly freed the engine of American industry. However, this sanitized version of events omits the darker, more predatory truth. The confiscation was not merely a monetary adjustment, it was a solvency mechanism for a bankrupt state. The government did not just want to print money, they needed to revalue their own liabilities at the expense of the citizenry's assets. By forcing the surrender of gold at $20.67 per ounce, and subsequently revaluing it to $35.00 per ounce with the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, the U.S. government instantly created a massive profit on its own books, a profit of nearly 70%, while simultaneously devaluing the paper dollars they had just forced the public to accept by roughly 40%. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, one must look closely at the legal machinery employed. FDR utilized the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 to justify the seizure. Originally designed to prevent commerce with wartime adversaries like Germany, the act was repurposed to treat the American saver as the enemy of the state. The hoarder, a derogatory term invented to shame the prudent, became the villain in a national melodrama. This weaponization of language is a critical component of financial repression. By framing the preservation of personal capital as an act of sabotage against the collective recovery, the state effectively inverted the moral hierarchy of property rights. The prudent became pariahs, and the reckless state became the savior. This psychological operation was so successful that even today, the term gold bug carries a connotation of paranoia, rather than historical literacy. Yet those who stood in line in May 1933, handing over their double eagles and bullion, were not paranoid, they were being systematically liquidated. The precedent set in 1933 is not a fossilized historical curiosity, it is the operating system of the modern financial world. It established a terrifying axiom: you do not own your wealth, you merely lease it from the government, and the terms of that lease can be altered unilaterally, overnight, under the guise of emergency. The Supreme Court cases that followed, specifically the Gold Clause cases of 1935, cemented this power. In a 5-4 decision, the court essentially ruled that the government's power to regulate money superseded private contracts. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, writing for the majority, argued that private contracts could not restrict the constitutional power of Congress to regulate the monetary system. It was a narrow victory for the state, but a total defeat for the concept of immutable property rights. The dissent, led by Justice James Clark McReynolds, was visceral. He reportedly threw his papers down in disgust and declared, "This is Nero at his worst." McReynolds understood what the majority chose to ignore. Once the state claims the authority to redefine the value of the unit of account, all other rights are effectively nullified, as the state can confiscate wealth simply by altering the denominator. To fully grasp the architecture of this theft, we must strip away the veneer of the New Deal mythology and examine the cold mechanics of the operation. Much like an autopsy of a crime scene that has been tampered with for 90 years, the economic landscape of the early 1930s was defined by a brutal deflationary collapse. Credit contracted, prices plummeted, and the velocity of money ground to a halt. In a gold standard system, this is the market's way of purging investment. It is painful, sharp, and necessary. However, for a government heavily indebted from World War I and the excesses of the Roaring Twenties, deflation is lethal. It increases the real value of debt. The United States government, and the banking cartel that supported it, faced a mathematical impossibility. They could not pay their debts in gold at the prevailing rate. They had promised more gold than existed. In the world of private business, this is called bankruptcy. In the world of sovereign states, it is an invitation to change the rules. The two engines framework of historical analysis illuminates this dynamic perfectly. Engine 1 is the macro-sovereign engine, the need of the state to survive its own fiscal irresponsibility. Engine 2 is the industrial social engine, the demand of the populace for relief from immediate pain. In 1933, these two engines collided. The public was desperate for relief from the Depression, creating the political cover for the state to execute a maneuver that served its own survival. The government needed to print money to inflate away its debt, but the gold standard acted as a golden fetter, a discipline mechanism that prevented the printing press from worry out of control. Every dollar printed had to be backed by 40% gold. To print more, the government either needed more gold or needed to change the price of gold. They chose to do both, by stealing it from the citizens and then marking up the price. Consider the specificity of the mechanism. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, under the guidance of George Harrison, was the operational hub of this transfer. We can look at the Federal Reserve's own archives from this period. The minutes from the Board of Governors meetings in early 1993 reveal a group of men grappling with a run on the dollar. Foreign central banks and savvy domestic investors were converting paper currency into gold at an alarming rate. They saw the insolvency on the horizon. The response from the Treasury, led by William Wooden, was not to shore up confidence through fiscal discipline, but to close the exit doors. The bank holiday of March 6, 1933, was the first step shutting down the entire banking system to stop the bleeding. Executive Order 6102 was the second step criminalizing the possession of the exit ramp. It is crucial to analyze the specific targets of the order. It exempted gold coins having a recognized special value to collectors of rare and unusual coins. This loophole allowed the wealthy elite, who often held numismatic collections, to bypass the confiscation that decimated the savings of the middle class. Furthermore, the order did not apply to gold held abroad by foreign central banks. It was a targeted strike against the domestic population, the very people the government claimed to represent. The subsequent Gold Reserve Act of January 1934 completed the maneuver. It transferred the ownership of all monetary gold in the United States to the U.S. Treasury. The Federal Reserve banks themselves were forced to hand over their gold in exchange for gold certificates, paper promises that could not be redeemed. This was the moment the Fed became a true captive of the Treasury, a relationship that persists in the shadows today. The aftermath of this confiscation rippled through the decades. It emboldened the government to engage in financial repression whenever the debt load became unmanageable. We saw echoes of this in 1971, when Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the convertibility of the dollar for foreign nations. While 1933 was a default on the American citizen, 1971 was a default on the world. The playbook is identical. When the promises exceed the ability to pay, the state changes the definition of payment. By decoupling the dollar from gold, the constraints on government expansion were removed entirely. The expansion of the welfare warfare state, the explosion of the national debt from billions to trillions, the erosion of the middle class saw all of these phenomena find their genetic origin in the capitulation of April 1933. The gold clause in contracts, which allowed lenders to demand payment in gold coin to protect against inflation, was declared void. This meant that if you lent money to a corporation or the government, you had no protection against them paying you back in devalued script. The risk of currency debasement was forcibly transferred from the borrower, the state, to the lender, the citizen. We must also look at the international context to see that this was not an isolated American phenomenon, but part of a contagion of state expansionism. In the 1920s and 30s, nations across the globe were abandoning orthodoxy. The Weimar Republic had already demonstrated the catastrophic endgame of unbacked paper in 1923. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, triggering a wave of currency devaluations. The U.S. move in 1933 was a competitive devaluation, a shot fired in a currency war designed to export unemployment to trading partners. By cheapening the dollar, U.S. exports became cheaper, but imports became more expensive for the American consumer. It was a policy of beggar-thymer, a desperate scramble for a slice of a shrinking global economic pie. The tragedy is that while it provided a temporary jolt to nominal prices, it sowed the seeds of the systemic instability that led to World War II. The breakdown of honest money invariably leads to the breakdown of international relations, as trade wars escalate into kinetic wars. Fast forward to the present day, and the relevance of 1933 becomes terrifyingly acute. We are currently living through a convergence of the exact same historical pressures that forced FDR's hand, but with technology that makes Executive Order 6100 to look primitive. The two engines are revving in the red zone once again. Engine 1 is the sovereign debt crisis. The U.S. national debt stands at over $34 trillion, a number so large it has lost all meaning to the average voter. But the math is undeniable. The interest payments on this debt are now consuming a larger portion of tax revenue than the defense budget. Just as in 1933, the government faces a binary choice: default honestly, which is political suicide, or default dishonestly via inflation and financial repression. They have chosen the latter. However, the mechanism of seizure has evolved. In 1933, they needed physical agents to inspect safety deposit boxes. They relied on voluntary compliance and the fear of a neighbor snitching. Today, the seizure does not need to be physical because the asset is digital. The gold of the 21st century for the average citizen is purchasing power stored in bank accounts and investment portfolios. The government does not need to issue an executive order confiscating your 401k. They simply need to engineer a real interest rate that is negative. If inflation is 5% and your bond yields 4%, the government is confiscating 1% of your wealth annually. This is the invisible heist, a slow-motion version of 1933 that operates continuously, eroding the savings of the middle class to bail out the profligacy of the state. But the convergence goes deeper. We are witnessing the rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. This is the technological apex of the 1933 philosophy. If cash is eliminated and all transactions must pass through a central ledger controlled by the Federal Reserve, the capacity for control becomes absolute. In 1933, you could still bury a gold coin in your backyard. In a CBDC world, there is no backyard. We saw a prelude to this potential dystopian reality during the Canadian trucker protests in 2022. The Canadian government, invoking the Emergencies Act, a modern spiritual successor to the Trading with the Enemy Act, froze the bank accounts of protesters and those who donated to them. It happened without a court order, without due process. In a matter of hours, the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, announced the expansion of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, rules to cover crowdfunding platforms and payment service providers. This was a 6102 moment for the digital age. It demonstrated that access to the financial system is a privilege granted by the state, not a right. The similarities between the rhetoric of 1933 and today are striking. Then, gold hoarders were blamed for the Depression. Today, cryptocurrency holders, gold investors, and even those who hold too much cash are often framed as facilitating illicit activity or evading taxes. The IMF's October 2023 Global Financial Stability Report subtly hints at the need for greater oversight of non-bank financial intermediaries. The language is bureaucratic, but the intent is controlled. The crypto winter and the regulatory crackdown on digital assets can be viewed through the lens of the state, eliminating competition for its own upcoming digital currency. Just as FDR had to eliminate gold to clear the path for the devalued dollar, modern central banks must domesticate or eliminate independent stores of value to clear the path for CBDCs. The state cannot tolerate a competitor to its monopoly on money, especially when it intends to abuse that monopoly. Furthermore, we must consider the asset class implication. In 1933, the asset that offered protection, gold, was the specific target of the confiscation. This teaches us a vital contrarian lesson. The most effective hedge is often the one the government is most eager to ban. Today, the assets that offer true sovereignty are those that exist outside the traditional banking system. This includes physical gold still, despite history, silver, direct ownership of productive land, and increasingly, Bitcoin. Bitcoin, in many ways, was architected specifically as a countermeasure to the 1933-1971 dynamic. It is a bearer asset that, if secured properly, cannot be seized by executive order without physical coercion of the key holder. It is the digital equivalent of the gold coin buried in the garden, but with the ability to be transported across borders in a human mind. The convergence of sovereign insolvency and digital surveillance makes these sovereign assets the most critical portfolio allocation of our lifetime. Yet the mainstream financial advice, the modern equivalent of the 1933 banking establishment, still pushes a 60/40 portfolio of stocks and bonds assets that are thoroughly captured by the system. As we stand at this precipice, looking back at the long shadow of April 1933, we must elevate our understanding from mere financial mechanics to the philosophical question of freedom itself. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it is encapsulated time. It represents the hours of your life you traded for labor, the ideas you brought to fruition, the sacrifices you made for future security. When the state seizes money, or systematically debases it, it is not just stealing purchasing power. it is stealing time. It is retroactively enslaving the citizenry by confiscating the fruits of their past labor. The gold heist of 1933 was a declaration that the American citizen is a resource to be harvested by the state, rather than a sovereign individual with unalienable rights to their own property. The stakes today are infinitely higher than they were in the 1930s. The interconnectedness of the global financial system means that a crisis of confidence in the US dollar, the world reserve currency, will not be contained within national borders. It will be a planetary event. The exorbitant privilege that the US has enjoyed since Bretton Woods is fraying. The BRICS nations are aggressively accumulating gold, seemingly preparing for a post-dollar world. Central banks bought more gold in 2022 and 2023 than in any year since 1967. Just before the London gold pool collapsed, they know what is coming. They are reading the same history books, but they are reading them as an instruction manual for survival, while the Western public reads them as fiction. The smart money is exiting the system that FDR built, moving back toward the very asset he outlawed. The horizon for this reckoning is not decades away. The cracks are visible now in the volatility of the bond market, the persistence of inflation despite rate hikes, and the geopolitical fracturing of the world economy. We are approaching the end of the long debt cycle, a concept popularized by Ray Dalio but evident to anyone studying the trajectory of fiat currencies. Historically, these cycles end in one of two ways: hard default collapse or soft default inflation, confiscation. The precedent of 1933 screams that the US government will choose the soft default. They will change the rules. They will implement capital controls. They will vilify those who try to exit the burning theater. The window to position oneself is narrowing. This is not a call to panic. Panic is for the unprepared. This is a call to a higher level of awareness. It is a challenge to reject the comfortable illusions of the Fed put and the safe haven of government bonds. It is a directive to understand that true wealth is that which has no counterparty risk. In 1933, the people who survived with their wealth intact were those who saw the order coming, or those who held assets that the government could not easily reach or value. Today, that means diversification not just across asset classes, but across jurisdictions and custody models. It means understanding that legal and moral are not synonymous when the state is fighting for its life. The image of President Roosevelt sitting at his desk, signing away the wealth of a nation with a stroke of a pen, should be burned into the retina of every investor. It serves as a permanent reminder that in the realm of fiat currency, there are no rights, only temporary privileges. The land of the free came with a hidden clause in 1933: you are free to earn, but the state reserves the right to decide what your earnings are worth. As we navigate the turbulent waters of the 2020s with debt spiraling and digital cages being constructed, the question is not whether the government would dare to do it again. The question is, why would you assume they won't? The ink on Executive Order 6102 may be dry, but the precedent it set is written in blood, and the pen is still in their hand.